At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
You are tuned in to the Foul Weather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
A Merry Christmas to everyone across Duck Country. We're going to do an abbreviated version of the Foul Weather Podcast today for Christmas, and we will be on the road next week somewhere in the Mississippi Delta chasing ducks. We do expect we'll still be able to bring you the normal Monday morning forecast episode, and then our note on why everyone should be a member of Ducks Unlimited. I hope everyone is getting some new toys for the duck blind, but let's first talk about that severe weather in the southeast U.S. and up the Atlantic coast. We certainly feel for those affected by the tornadoes, right? The high winds, the flood conditions, and we really wish everybody a speedy recovery in this holiday season. We also want to express that everyone should be safe out there as the rains continue throughout the South where they happen, right? I know there's drought conditions in most places, but there are some areas starting to get rain, and that is likely to continue with this El Nino winter. So for those of you getting rain, be careful if there's any floodwaters, right? No duck is worth your life, so be safe, my friends. For the ducks and duck hunters, we really hope the rain continues to fill in the drought map, kind of changing those orange and red colors used to designate drought to green and blues, showing kind of normal to above normal water flows on our rivers. The areas that really need rain include Indiana, southern Illinois, much of Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, southern Texas, and central Kansas, among others. Whew. It's a big area with really bad drought conditions right now. The Atlantic coast got inches of rain in most places, but while this will make, great habitat for ducks, it also spreads out, the already kind of low numbers of birds that are there. Ducks in the Atlantic flyway are really from the Great Lakes to Florida in varying degrees of abundance, but really few concentrations because of our fairly mild winter to date. So more on where the ducks are at after our migration forecast. For our Christmas episode, we wanted to jump right into the good news this week with a bit of a different podcast format and tell you Santa's got a bag of ducks for y'all. All right, I don't want to act like this is a huge kind of winter storm or cold front, but we are certainly in a better spot this week than we've been for nearly a month since a lot of our further south friends' seasons opened. Weather severity index values are finally getting great enough in Montana, Wyoming, and South Dakota, as well as Iowa, to move more mallards south this week. There's actually a blizzard warning that's been issued for areas of southeast South Dakota and Nebraska, which, along with freezing temperatures, is forecast to move a good number of mallards south. For the farther west areas, the weekend and into next week really looks like a good bet for a push of mallards, but farther east in the Mississippi Flyway, movement may actually start earlier in the week, but it should pick up as the week goes on. Look for a good push of new mallards into the latitude of Missouri for the coming weekend, so, Happy New Year's, y'all. For all the other species, look for a push into the deeper south, into Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. I'd say pintails and gadwall, with some leftover early ducks like shoveler, green-winged teal, and widgeon moving in that mix. Farther east, the cold doesn't push as far south, and mallard migration is unlikely for, it's maybe a small push late in the week. For early migrants, a trickle is expected all week with greatest chances of new ducks in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida for the coming weekend. Rain from Christmas Eve hit the Texas kind of coast and Louisiana coast. It's now moving towards Alabama and South Carolina. right? Hopefully, again, this creates some new habitat for ducks and duck hunters. Unfortunately, the reality is that ducks that did show up into the drought-stricken region, well, they're kind of, and I'll comment on this a little bit later too, they're starting to move east and west up rivers in search of food in safe places that don't have pressure, right? Even places throughout Missouri, in the absence of any new migrants, any new good numbers of ducks, their duck numbers are declining, likely as they move to find food and refuge, right? This is probably why, like, the mid-Oklahoma and Texas, the mid-Oklahoma-Texas border is generally the bright spot for ducks right now. They also have water. So, if there's any bright spot for ducks right now, that's kind of it. That mid-border, along an east-west line, mid-Oklahoma-Texas border. It has some good water, better than that drought area, and it's kind of the bright spot for ducks right now. So not a huge cold front that has widespread snow, but it's better than what we've been getting, right? For comparison, on Christmas Day last year, the snow line dipped as far south as Oklahoma, northern Arkansas, and western Tennessee. Okay, some of that was just a dusting, but they were cold enough to have snow. This year, we still have areas of Manitoba and Saskatchewan that are snow-free. It's amazing how mild it's been. And here's the deal. The ducks are everywhere. So let's tackle that one. I was a guest on Ramsey Russell's podcast, Duck Season Somewhere, and that episode should come out relatively soon. I think that he and I did a very good job of dissecting the topic of, where are the ducks? And I'm going to cover a little bit of that here as well. The Foul Weather Podcast team knew the question of where are the ducks would rear its ugly head about this time if we followed the typical El Nino pattern, and kind of finger pointing would continue unless we saw some major cold and snow front, in the coming weeks. The mallard numbers in Arkansas right now haven't been this bad since 2009, which, if people don't keep up, was another El Nino year with pretty strong drought conditions. So it's not surprising there aren't ducks in the big woods of Arkansas right now. There's been a lot of talk about that the waterfowl breeding population surveys can't be right. The biologists are wrong. But where were these comments during the colder winters? They nearly always surface about the time people get frustrated at southern latitudes in warm years, especially drought years. Some of this has to do with declining abundance of mallards, for sure, right? The breeding population was down 23%. So let's say, 1 in 4 mallards isn't there anymore. But it's not surprising that mallard numbers have declined some because there have been drier conditions on the prairies of late. Nothing like the 1980s, nothing like the Great Depression, but there have been some drier conditions that may have reduced mallard populations slightly. So there is something to a small decline in mallards, but nothing on massive scales that would cause this number of mallards to not be in Arkansas. It's basically the weather. It's pretty easy, folks. We'll get into that here in a bit.
This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
So here's the deal, though. The folks up north typically don't complain about a lack of ducks because the ducks tend to be in a lot of our places nowadays well into January. The mid-latitude folks don't complain about no ducks because they're the new wintering area for many of these species, especially mallards. So the complaints typically come from the deep south, and we all feel for y'all for sure. I mean, that said, it's still better. And the folks are going to hate this comment, right? Because it's gotten worse, right? Because of these warm winters and these types of conditions that hold ducks north. But y'all are still shooting a lot of ducks compared to other places. Heck, Arkansas alone shoots more ducks in that state than the entire Atlantic Flyway. And Louisiana shoots more ducks annually than the entire country of Canada. Whoa. But yeah, it's gotten worse over the past few decades. And yes, it's mostly about mallards not showing up in their historic numbers. But here's the deal. It's not Delta Waterfowl's fault. It's not Ducks Unlimited's fault. It's not the government's fault. It's simply warmer and there's less snow on some years nowadays. So where are the ducks? Without snow and with relatively mild conditions, they are everywhere, right? We said it last week and we'll say it again. They are everywhere. I mean, heck, guys in South Dakota were still shooting 6-man limits of greenheads just last week. Not a hen in the bunch. Which means, they can pick those greenheads out. There's enough birds that they're actually picking greenheads, right? In the Atlantic Flyway, we know that stuff gets crummy sometimes. And sometimes you shoot a hen here and there to finish up your bag. But these guys are shooting 6-man limits of greenheads in South Dakota nearly about Christmas, right? There's barely a drop of ice in most places in the shallow bays and the Great Lakes. And, there's ice farther north in Minnesota at the farthest north locations in some areas in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but not much else throughout the rest of duck country. It was 50 degrees in Montana just last Friday. And also folks will say, oh, the midwinter survey shows that there's no ducks. Well, the midwinter survey is not really intended to count ducks and be used for harvest management. The intent of the midwinter survey is primarily to estimate trends in species we don't count well on their breeding grounds, like brant and tundra swans. It's not built to index something like mallards, which are a very generalist species that will kind of be anywhere, right? It's the midwinter survey is just not meant to count them. Nor is the midwinter survey meant to be comparable to estimates from the breeding grounds. So anybody that's trying to talk about midwinter survey compared to breeding grounds is really comparing apples to oranges. Anyhow, we don't want to get too far into the weeds. All of this is mild temperatures and lack of snow, and we forecast this, the Foul Weather Podcast team forecast this back in October with our long-term seasonal forecast, and that forecast has not changed. We're simply in a strong El Nino year with a jet stream that's really keeping cold air very far north. That, coupled with basically no snow, results in a lot of mallards that can just stay north. It's also led to diving ducks staying on the northern rivers and Great Lakes. And so, we're getting hit with that. We don't expect a big push to finish off our season in New York of those divers. There's no way that it's getting cold enough to move them out of Lake St. Clair, out of Long Point, and places like that into the Finger Lakes region. It's probably going to be far from it this year. So no snow and all that waste grain at northern latitudes, open rivers, open lakes, open shallow wetlands even in some areas, has just really stalled mallard migration. And, we're not going to touch this now, but for about 5 hot seconds. But the waste grain alone across this country, given how many acres we have, after harvest, can feed a ton of ducks. And it's not some conspiracy by Delta Waterfowl or Ducks Unlimited to grow and flood corn so the ducks stay north. These two organizations have done more for duck habitat and duck hunters than any other two organizations in North America. But I get it, right? Everybody wants something or someone to point their finger at when the ducks don't show up. It's frustrating, but here's the deal. It's way easier than you think. The winter is just mild this year for a duck, and if they don't have to fly all the way south and cross multiple states and multiple opening days to possibly get shot, they just aren't. I said this before, and it sounds really simple, but no duck wants to get shot. If all they are doing is going back north to breed at the end of all this, then a lot of them are just going to stay north. Now, of course, all ducks are different, just like people, and some made movements farther south than others on those early cold fronts. We had that early cold front in October that really froze up a lot of stuff in the Dakotas, and yeah, birds moved on that. But we haven't had much of that recently, right? And, so we've got ducks from the Dakotas to Louisiana with some concentrations at mid-latitudes. But nobody right now is blown up with ducks like other years at this point. They're just kind of everywhere. So I know it sounds like a simple answer, but sometimes the simplest answer is the easiest answer, right? It's just warm, mild, no snow, and ducks are kind of everywhere. So if you have friends that just don't seem to notice that the weather isn't that ducky, share the Foul Weather Podcast with them, because we're certainly in a mild year, and we've definitely been tracking that and reporting on those trends for months now. As noted, the Foul Weather Podcast team will be hunting in Missouri, Mississippi, and Texas from after Christmas till around the 5th of January. So stay tuned as we report on what we see along the way. As we travel, we'll be recording conversations with friends in their kitchens, so keep your eyes out as we will be releasing our first episodes of the Kitchen Conversations in the Marsh series, which are conversations with duck hunters in duck country and raw, mic'd up conversations and shoots throughout duck country USA. Spread the word about the Foul Weather Podcast. We produce the only duck migration forecast available. Ducks will move. They will migrate. Follow us to find out when and where. Remember to share, follow, and rate us for free. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Facebook, and Instagram. We appreciate it if you'd take the time to rate the Foul Weather Podcast, and we thank you for your support. Also, look us up on the web at foulweather.co, where you'll find episode links, recipes, and additional information about how to support the Foul Weather Podcast. We are the forecast to your next successful hunt. Thank you for listening, and as always, may your skies be filled, and shoot straight, my friends.